Alma, meaning to cherish, by Bess Aldrich. Alma was 9 years old when she came to live with Grandpa and Grandma Drew, a nondescript little person with freckles like so many pale raisins across a tilted nose, big blue eyes that made her thin face look top-heavy, and ashy light hair tied tightly back in horsetail formation. Because Alma's dead father had been an only child, Grandma Drew had never sewed for a little girl, so she made the child dresses rather like her own of the early 80s, with very full skirts gathered onto deep yokes. Alma knew they were not right, but she didn't know just what she could do about it. Once, when she had ventured to suggest something ready-made, Grandma explained patiently, tearfully, that they couldn't afford it, that there was some money in the bank for Alma, but that it must never be touched until after high school. For if they were economical and did not use a dollar of it, Alma could go away to college someday. If the little girl vaguely sensed that an occasional dress in hand would have been worth two in a bush on some potential campus, she would not hurt Grandma's feelings by saying so. And after all, it gave one a feeling of importance to realize that one had money in a big gray stone bank. The big stone bank belonged to Mr. Withers, and Grandpa Drew, who was really old Peter Drew, took care of Mr. Withers' yard. The Drew house, a small one-story frame, stood on 11th Street next to the alley and at right angles to the garage end of the Withers home, which fronted on Sherman Avenue. To the diminutive Alma, the Withers place constituted the last word in grandeur. Paradise itself probably could contain nothing more lovely than that which lay beyond the privet hedge. The house was of dark brown brick, with gay striped awnings and a stretch of sparkling glass windows clear across one side. In spring, the yard was a riot of snowy bridal wreath and blood-red tulips and blue irises. There were white garden seats, a winding brick path, and a pool where a green iron frog spouted water impudently at an iron bird that was either a heron or a stork. Grandpa had other yards, too, which he sometimes scrupulously groomed, but for the most part he was busy at the Withers place, where the bridal wreath and the crimson tulips and the blue irises took his attention until the roses came on. When Grandpa mowed, Alma would sit on the steps and pretend she lived there at the great house with the sun parlor and the gay awnings. She would lose herself so deeply in the pretense that she fancied she could hear people driving past say enviously, "Wouldn't it be grand to live there, like that lovely little girl?" It is quite possible, however, that she caused very little envy in the hearts of her observers, for there was no one in the whole community who did not know that S.T. Withers lived there, and that he and his wife had one son, Rexford, and not even a lovely little girl, to say nothing of one with freckles across a tip-tilted nose, a horsetail of ashy light hair, and dresses with yokes. To Alma, the three Witherses were all that storied people could possibly be. Mr. Withers was tall and slender, with an iron gray mustache, and he walked springily, not like Grandpa, who plodded heavily. Mrs. Withers was slight and sparkling. Her dark eyes laughed, and when she talked, her voice laughed, and when she served tea out on the brick terrace, her hands moved over the cups like white birds fluttering. Rexford was 15, and he had everything a prince could want, including a watch and a Kodak and a bicycle. Alma did not know him. She merely knew all this by the simple process of peeking. Only once, just before he went away to a boys' school, did she come face to face with him near the pool, where the green frog sat spouting all day. He said, "Hey there, kid, how are ya?" And Alma said, "All right," and began humming with assumed nonchalance, and hippity-hopped back home through the hedge. He did not even know her name, but Alma was glad of that, for she had no deep admiration for it, It was too short and sounded too babyish. Just Alma. It had no meaning. If she could have renamed herself the way the teacher said the Chinese did, she would have been Rosamond Dorothy Drew. Always when she sat on the Withers steps waiting for Grandpa, she thought of herself as Rosamond Dorothy, instead of the babyish Alma that had no meaning. And then, one day at school, when she was browsing about idly in the back of the big dictionary, she found some pages titled Common English Christian Names, 1 masculine, 2 feminine. Quite suddenly, her research work in Department 2 became feverishly intensive. It was scarcely possible, of course, that it would be there. Abigail, Ada, Alice. It was there. Alma. Alma, meaning to cherish. As she was quite in the dark about what it meant to cherish, she laboriously looked that up, too. It seemed that it was to hold dear, to treat or keep with tenderness or affection, to nurture with care, to protect and aid, to harbor in the mind, cling to. Just what it was that she was to hold dear, to harbor in the mind, cling to, she had not the remotest idea. In fact, she was 15 before she knew. But one does not jump from 9 to 15 as nimbly as it is written. One lives through long, painful years if one doesn't like funny-looking dresses, but loves the maker of them. If one is obliged to hear one's grandfather called Old Peter by children when one knows what a nice old man he is. But to offset the distressing experiences, Alma's freckles at 15 were gradually and mysteriously disappearing into the soft pinkness of a lovely skin. Her ashy light roll of hair looked neat against the white column of her neck, and she was beginning to make her own clothes. About this last, she had figured out that if the material must always be cheap, dresses must be made cleverly. So she wore slim, plain brown ones with sheer white collars and cuffs, or blue batiste that matched exactly the shade of her eyes. Not once did Grandpa or Grandma touch the money for any of these modest expenditures. It was safely there in Mr. Withers' gray stone bank, gathering interest, like some golden-fingered magician, and waiting until the time when Alma would be ready for college. No longer did she go over to the big yard with Grandpa. A sophomore in high school, she was too old now to hang about childishly. But she was still not above peeking through the hedge at times to watch the gay life over there. Rex was in Yale, but he always came back for the Christmas holidays and for a few weeks each summer before he and his mother went north to their lake cottage. For those few weeks of each year, there were exciting doings beyond the hedge. Mr. Rexford Withers gave a dancing party. Or Mr. Rexford Withers was host at a dinner, would head the Courier's society column. These parties were always exclusively for the crowd. The crowd was a group as inextricably set apart from the rest of the young people of the town as is the Supreme Court from its associates, as definitely limited by boundary lines as the Withers yard by its hedge. For the most part, the members were from the homes that faced the park, or those farther up on Sherman Avenue. Irene Bentley, who was Rex's girl, and the Barlow twins, Sally and Nancy, and Ted and Marion Vanskoy, and Bob Robertson, and a few others. They fascinated Alma, peeking surreptitiously through the hedge to see them drive in, gay and noisy. She used to imagine how they would look later, coming down the winding mahogany stairway that she had glimpsed through the door. The girls in their modish gowns, and the young men in their evening clothes. It was the ideal, the way life ought to be lived. The background against which they moved was a standard of perfection, not one of the golden oak furniture and geraniums in paper-covered tomato cans, and Grandpa's pipes and papers lying about. The Christmas vacation that Alma was 15 was the gayest holiday time over at the Witherses she had ever known. Lights blazed from the basement to the third floor. Rex was home from Yale, Bob Robertson from Amherst, Ted and Marion Van Scoy from State University. The crowd went in and out constantly. The paper announced Irene Bentley's and Rex's engagement. When the lights ceased to burn and the gay affairs were over, Alma felt that nothing would be worthwhile until the coming of the summer, when she could again be an onlooker at a life that was ideal. But when spring came on, with the tulips nosing up through the moist turf, events happened that changed everything. The Witherses' Christine told Grandma through the hedge that Mrs. Withers hadn't been well since Christmas, that they had taken her to the hospital now, and no one could tell how it was going to turn out. Then, even before the outcome was certain, the astounding news came that Mr. Withers' bank had not opened that morning. When Grandpa and Grandma heard it, they went white and stared at each other as though bereft of their reason. "The money," they said in unison. "The money for Alma's college education." Alma had forgotten all about that phase of the catastrophe in thinking with horror that the Witherses could never live that lovely way anymore, that all the gaiety of the crowd was a thing of the past, that life could never again go on over there as it had done. She wouldn't for the world have wanted Grandpa and Grandma to know, but she was more sorry about that than on account of her own loss. The town was wild about the closing of the bank. Threatening talk flew about because Mr. Withers had lost people's money. But Grandpa said he could not associate the things they were saying with the kindness of the man for whom he worked, that there must have been great forces behind it for which Mr. Withers was not to blame. Mrs. Withers did not get well. Christine, with red eyes, told Grandma across the hedge that she guessed the news had killed her. But Grandma said that if bad news alone could kill, lots of folks who were living would be dead. Rex was home from Yale, but no longer was the crowd over there, just Rex and his father. Alma could see them walking up and down the brick walk where the bridal wreath was bursting into white froth. Sometimes she would hear Rex trying to coax his father to go into the house, but he would only walk up and down, up and down. Alma, on her side of the high hedge, ached with responsive anguish for the anguish of Rex and his father. Up and down, up and down. It was one evening, when Rex was in the house, that Alma heard the weird staccato sound in the garden, like something cracking, and saw Grandpa rush faster through the hedge than she thought he could move. Alma, too, was rushing after him when Grandma called her sharply to come back and wouldn't let her go at all. It was true. Mr. Withers had killed himself on the seat by the pool where the green frog sat. All those things had happened to the Withers family between the gaiety of the holidays and the blossoming of the bridal wreath. It seemed unbelievable that all this made no difference to the garden, that crimson tulips bloomed as lovely as ever, and the blue irises. A few days later, when Grandpa came home, he said he had a good piece of news to tell. Mr. Withers's insurance money, which would have gone to Rex, was to be turned over to the depositors. Grandpa said that he heard the place had been in Mrs. Withers' name, and Rex was going to keep it, that, except for enough money to get to New York, he was turning over the insurance, and that Alma was to get 70 cents on the dollar now, instead of the 50 or 60 she might have had. Alma knew she should have been pleased about it, but somehow she couldn't be. Christine, who was moving her things away, told Grandma through the hedge that Irene Bentley wasn't going to marry Rex after all. And that, to Alma, seemed the hardest of all to understand. If Irene had loved Rex at holiday time, why did she not love him when the irises bloomed? The next night, just before time for the flyer, Rex and his dog came through the hedge. Rex had on a dark suit and a turned-down hat pulled over his eyes, and he gave Grandpa a key to the house and said to keep the yard up a little and he would send money. He had not paid any attention to Alma standing near until he was turning to leave, when he said, "Hey, kid, would you mind feeding Jack for me?" Alma took an impulsive step forward. "Oh, I'll do anything." It was a cry of human sympathy from the depths of a grieving 15-year-old heart. Rex said, "Thanks," and started back through the hedge with Jack trying to follow him, so that he had to stamp his foot and tell him sharply to go back. Then suddenly he called Jack and put his arms around him and bowed his head and turned his face away. And Alma ran into the house and cried for Rex and for all the lost loveliness of life. And from that day on, she knew what it was that she was to cherish. For the next day or two, Alma could not bear to look over toward the big house, so forlorn now that it seemed a human being from which the living soul had fled. But Grandpa went over several times. He set out the gladiola bulbs as though nothing had happened and trimmed the terrace. On the third day, he said to Grandma, "I think you better unlock the door and go in. I can see through the window, and, boy-like, he's left food on the kitchen table, and there are ivy plants in the sun parlor." So Grandma, walking slowly with rheumatism in her bad leg, and Alma went through the hedge and over to the big house, carrying the key to paradise. When Grandma was unlocking the big hall door, Alma knew that never again in life would she experience that same queer, suffocating feeling of expectancy. The house where she had glimpsed such lovely things was to be entered, and with no prying eyes to see, just she and Grandma going in as though they owned it. They opened the big door and stepped in. The great mahogany stairway curved down into the hallway, darkly gleaming against the white of the woodwork. The sun came through a window on the landing and caught and held all the soft lights of the rug. Alma stood and visualized the crowd coming down the stairs, heard them laugh as they descended, Rex and Irene Bentley and the Barlow twins and Bob Robertson and the others. And they would never come laughing down the stairway again. She felt a sadness that was overwhelming in its intensity. For a little while, she and Grandma walked about, tiptoeing, peering into the various rooms, shy as trespassers. The drawing room was in dull green, with mahogany furniture, and the walls were satin. The dining room was dark and paneled, and Grandma thought it was kind of gloomy, but Alma knew it was just right. There were fireplaces and books, rugs as thick as Grandpa's bluegrass lawn, and a grand piano from which a single silver frame picture of Rex watched them with his dark, smoldering eyes. It gave Alma an uncanny feeling of guilt. They went upstairs, Grandma pulling herself up by the mahogany railing. One bedroom was all in rose color, with stiff taffeta curtains tied back over china knobs. One looked as though the blue irises and the tulips from the garden had been scattered over all the fat chairs and the bedspread. And then there was Rex's room. They could tell by the college pennants and the pictures of the crowd. The bed was tumbled and unmade, so Grandma took off the pillowcases and the sheets and tied them in a bundle to take home to wash. If Grandma hadn't been there, Alma knew she would have cried. But she didn't want even Grandma to know how she cherished the memory of Rex. There was a stairway to the third floor, and Grandma told Alma she'd better run up and see if everything was all right there. She was gone so long that Grandma called to know what was the matter. There was nothing at all the matter, except that Alma, in the great stillness, had fallen to dreaming of the young people who had come there to dance on the shining floor and who would never come again. They took the perishable food home. Grandma wrote it down on a little pad in her kitchen. 7 eggs, a loaf of bread, 3 strips of bacon, and a 1/4 pound of butter. She would keep it so she could pay Rex back if he came home that fall. But Rex did not come home. Grandpa took up the bulbs and nailed boards across the basement windows. Leaves blew into the pool and covered the green frog and the iron legs of the heron or stork. Then spring again, and Grandma and Alma went over to the big house because Grandma thought they ought to take out the quilts and look them over for moths. This time she took home the canned fruit in the basement and used it. But each summer thereafter, she would can the exact number: 8 quarts of cherries, 10 quarts of strawberries, 5 quarts of peaches, to have them ready for Rex. It came to be, as the years went by, that Alma had cleaned everything. She had even taken all the lovely dresses out of the closet, brushing them tenderly, as though attending to some religious rite, the black lace over silk, and the dark wine-colored velvet, and the black velvet evening coat with the white satin lining. Sometimes Grandma said Alma was foolish to put all that work on it when she wasn't getting any pay, but Alma would never answer her. For no one was getting any pay, not even Grandpa anymore. The money had come from Rex for a while, and then it ceased. But each year, Grandpa trimmed the honeysuckles and the bridal wreath and the roses, cut back the blue irises, and set out the gladiola bulbs. He never told anyone that he was no longer the gardener. "You'll get old Peter Drew after you," people would say to anyone attempting to trespass. And everyone thought he was the hired caretaker. Alma went away to college, and very soon she was 21. But one does not jump from 15 to 21 as nimbly as it is written. One lives through happy, important years. And if one has not had many dollars in the first place and must perforce get along with only 70 cents for each one of these, one must be very careful to dress cleverly, to see that one's good looks become genuinely lovely and one's happy disposition makes countless friends. If one can do this, the other 30 cents do not matter so much. It was June, with the crimson ramblers queening it over the old garden, and Alma, graduated from college the week before, was now making her first summer pilgrimage to the Mecca of her childish dreams. The place looked run down, she was thinking. Grandpa was getting older and slower, and 6 years is a long time for a home to be without a tenant. Grass was matted between the bricks of the path. The green frog had lost one of his bulging eyes, and the heron that might have been a stork was tipping a little giddily on his thin iron legs. She was thinking that Grandpa had told her Rex's taxes were delinquent for the last legal time, and the place would be sold if he didn't come home and see about it. The news saddened her, but she quickly put it from her mind for a happier thought, that 3 of her sorority sisters were driving through town that afternoon on their way to Yellowstone and would stop for an hour or so. She was wishing that Grandma wasn't bedfast and nervously fussy just now about callers, and that the golden oak furniture by some wave of a magic wand could be... That was as far as she went in her wishing, for inspirationally, she knew she was entertaining the girls in the Withers home. Why not? Hadn't she and Grandma cleaned in every corner of it? Didn't she feel quite at home there now? Wasn't it a happy solution? Temptation, unlike vice, is not necessarily a creature of frightful mien. With gay energy, she set about making preparations. She aired the stuffy house and went over it with her dustcloth and floor mop. She set bowls of crimson ramblers about, and with only a slight stab of conscience, took down some spode tea things. She would bring over an alcohol burner for the tea, for, of course, there was no electric current now. After all these energetic preparations, 2 o'clock found her sitting on the steps of the Withers porch, watching for the car. The girls would be looking for the 11th Street address, and so she must not let them drive by. It gave her a queer feeling to be sitting there on the steps, just as she used to do when she was little. For her own amusement, she repeated her childish formula, "I'm the lovely little girl who lives here," which was 50% more true than in the old days, for had she but known it, 2 women driving by at that moment and seeing her there were saying, "Didn't Alma Drew turn out to be the prettiest thing?" She recalled her old feeling of awe for the crowd. How queer the way life had treated some of them. Irene Bentley was assisting in her husband's store. The Barlows had been having a hard time. Marion Van Scoy was working in a tea room. Rex's taxes were unpaid. The crowd now represented a whole economic upheaval. It would have taken a treatise on world conditions to have written about them as they had been and as they were now. There they came, the girls, driving slowly and looking for the house. Because the Withers' number was hidden by ivy vines, they would not notice the discrepancy in the address. She waved at them, and the car slipped up the drive and came to a stop near her. There were gay greetings and noisy laughter, so that instinctively Alma gave a swift thought to the fact that they must have looked and acted quite as the crowd had in years gone by. Jack lumbered around the corner of the house and wagged a friendly tail with feeble dignity. The four went into the house, and the college reunion against the background of the mellow old furnishings became a very pleasant thing for Alma. She felt neither uncomfortable nor strange. If she had made any plan to explain to them that she was borrowing the house because of Grandma's illness, she did not do so at once, and when the first opportunity had gone by, she found she could not tell at all. She evaded false statements adroitly and made inconsequential answers to pertinent questions, as who was the good-looking man in the silver frame on the concert grand? Just a neighbor boy, she said, and that was over. No one knows why these uncannily strange things happen. Why, for instance, out of all the days, of all the years that had gone by, this was the day on which Rex Withers came home. Alma had been saying, "When I started to read it, I found it so The word snapped off on a broken syllable, for a key was turning in the lock of the side door that had been closed for 6 years, and Rex Withers was opening it, was standing on the threshold of the room. His face was grave. Unsmiling, he stood, looking with somber eyes at the group, apparently showing neither surprise nor annoyance, merely suspended thought concerning the situation. Alma's mind seemed blank, her body paralyzed, as though neither mentally nor physically were her faculties or members able to function. Rex had come, and she was entertaining guests in his home. Obviously, something must be done about it. For that long, vibrant moment, she stared across at him. And then quite suddenly, her brain sprang into action like a soldier called to duty. Immediately, she became Alma Jekyll and Alma Hyde, nerves taut to the fingertips. Alma, the college graduate, who in 4 years of training had learned to carry herself graciously through various social crises, was walking up to Rex with extended hand, was saying, "Why, Rex, I didn't know you were in town. How are you?" And Rex was saying gravely, "Very well, and how are you?" "These are sorority sisters of mine who are on their way to Yellowstone and whom I want you to meet. Let me present Mr. Rex Withers, Adele, Miss Langdon." "Ah, the neighbor boy," Adele said with bright pertness. "Yes, the neighbor boy." The girls took it up in jesting tone, so that the blue eyes of the other personality, the Alma Drew who was only the gardener's little granddaughter, darkened with embarrassment and fright, met the questioning eyes of Rex Withers, and said with all the force of her mentality, "Don't give it away. Please, play up to me." And he did. If he was mystified, he did not show it. For in the next half hour, he assisted materially in keeping the conversation on the general and remarkably safe topics of Yellowstone Park, the new books, aeronautics, modernistic paintings, daylight holdups, and the habits of owls. And when Alma went to the kitchen to get the tea things with a gay, "I'm both hostess and maid," Rex asked if he could help. Alma said no, that each one was to carry out her own things. When they had gone out to the terrace in laughing single file, Jack came lumbering up, gave his bleary old man look at Rex, and began pumping his tail wildly, so that Adele Langdon said pertly, "Aha, I have it. You're the favorite caller." For the next hour, Alma Drew, with the one endeavor in life to keep the situation in hand, quite possibly proved she had missed her calling, for no actress ever put on a better performance. And all the time over her head, the sword of Damocles was swinging and swinging. But all groups of 60 minutes do eventually pass, and Adele was saying, "Time's up, girls, signing off. We promised an aunt of mine we'd honor her with our presence this evening. 3 down and 200 miles to go. I wish you could go with us, Alma." So did Alma. If only she could have put on her hat and crawled into that back seat, never to look back, never to come back, merely to have thrown herself comfortably and peacefully into Old Faithful Geyser. And now one of the girls was saying, "Alma, this is just the way I would have imagined you, all cool and unperturbed like this, with an old garden behind you." And to Rex Withers, "She fits in the picture, doesn't she?" Rex Withers looked for a moment into the depths of his mother's old Spode teacup. "Perfectly," he said. There were farewell quips and laughter. Rex moved his own car so that the girls could get out. They backed, turned by the garage, waved gaily, were gone. And Alma Drew and Rex Withers stood alone on the brick terrace. Alma did not let a moment pass. "I know what you're thinking," she said courageously. "And the worst isn't terrible enough. I don't know why I did it." The relief of getting the horrible thing off her mind was immeasurable. "I want you to know I have never done it before. Grandma and I came in every year and cleaned and kept things in good condition. You'll find them so, I am sure. But not until today did I ever take advantage of having the key. To ask the girls here." She spared herself not at all. It was cheap, chiseling. She talked on and on with self-flagellation. Rex was looking at her with the somber, smoldering eyes she remembered so well. "Wait. Do I understand you're apologizing for—" He motioned toward the old house there behind them in the mellow June sunlight. "For being here? If it could be called by so mild a thing. Let's walk," he said suddenly, picked up one of Alma's hands and tucked it under his arm. Down the brick walk, straight to the pool he went, by the white seat where it had happened. It did not seem strange to Alma to be walking down that brick path with Rex. It seemed very natural, as though she were living over something that had happened many times before in another world. Perhaps that was because it had happened in the world of dreams. Still, with Alma's hand tucked under his arms, he was saying, "It's my turn to talk now. To make it clear what I want to say to you, you must know that the first year away was, well, not so good. The world pretty well collapsed for me that spring here at home. When I went east, I tried to get into something, but couldn't seem to get going. I had always expected, in a careless fashion, to go in with Father here in the bank. So when I was thrown out on my own, well, you know these little robins that can't seem to get to picking up their own worms? I couldn't find any worms. It appeared that there was no place for a bright young college man whose ideas of work had been mostly those revolving around his fraternity's social affairs. Once, I got so low that I almost thought I, too—" He made a passing gesture toward the white seat, so that Alma said with a little cry, "Oh, no!" He grinned and patted her hand. "Oh, I'm all right now. The world's a pretty decent old place. Banking being in the blood, I suppose, I finally landed a job in a bank. And 2 promotions in 5 years aren't so bad. I'm no moneyed plutocrat, but things are jogging along very well." He dropped his lighter tone and said gravely, "All those years I hung on to the place here like grim death. It seemed dumb not to sell, but I couldn't quite bring myself to it. With their things all here. Fate must have had a little something to do with it, though, for Robertson of Dad's old bank reorganized, ran on to me when he was east a while ago, and finding that I wasn't doing so badly, offered me the assistant cashiership here." "Here?" said Alma, and caught back the excitement in her tone with, "That's very nice for you." "The offer was tempting," he went on, "but whenever I thought of coming back, it seemed too dreadful to contemplate, unbearable. I decided to come and prove to myself that it couldn't be done, to live here. Perhaps you can sense how I had to steel myself to do it. I've lived this homecoming over 100 times, and the experience was terrible. And now, after all that, when I get here, to find you, I don't understand. It isn't awesome nor unbearable, and I think I am staying. It isn't not even very sad. It's merely peaceful and homelike, as though I'd found..." Suddenly, as though he realized he was rushing things a bit, he broke off and bent to look into Alma's lovely face. "And so you're the little kid next door? Old Pete, Mr. Drew's granddaughter? And you've been away to college. Say, you're not engaged or anything, are you?" he asked in sudden alarm. "Yes," she said blithely, "for a year, to the school board." And they both laughed, the untroubled laughter of youth. "And your name is Alma. I guess I never even knew your name. It's funny, I've known a lot of girls, but somehow I never happened to know one by the name of Alma. I'm glad I never have, for now it's just you." Alma turned blue eyes to him, eyes that contained mirth and something infinitely more tender. "It means," she said, not shyly nor sentimentally, as femininity might once have done, but humorously and daringly, quite in the modern way. "It means to cherish, to hold dear, to treat or keep with tenderness and affection, to harbor in the mind, cling to." And the green frog leered impudently with his one good eye at the heron that probably was a stork.